Welcome back, Fantasy Nation, to Johnny Freak in Fantasy Week 9 edition. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we have a lot to talk about. 21 offensive players, 16 defensive players. That's a lot. That's the most I've ever done. 37 combined players, so I'm going to go ahead and get at you. A lot of the names I'm going to drop today are, in fact, Week 9 startable. However, a lot of them are speculative and perhaps Week 10 starters due to so many buys, but I'm going to keep you in the loop, even with players who are on the bye. So we're going to get started with our quarterbacks, and I only am going to talk about one this week, and that's Ryan Fitzpatrick from Tampa Bay, only owned in 9% of Yahoo leagues. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, he's back. I went ranting about his Week 4 benching in Chicago in the fantasy community, and I just don't understand professionally why he was benched in the first place. I think Ryan Fitzpatrick gives the Tampa Bay Buccaneers the best chance to win. I think Jameis Winston has proved time after time that he's a turnover machine. I understand he has potential, but maybe down the stretch, I think the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to have to think about alternative routes. But for right now, Fitzpatrick gives them the best chance to win. They have incentives with starting Fitzpatrick as well. If they do play Jameis and he gets hurt, they have another year on his contract, so they're not looking to pay him. It looks like this year. Interesting fact: Jameis Winston has only thrown 4 more completed passes, than Ryan Fitzpatrick. And the stat is, Jameis Winston's thrown for 148 passes, and those have gone for 1,181 yards with 6 touchdowns and 10 interceptions, which is a little bit undesirable. And Fitzpatrick, on the other hand, 144 passes, like I said, only 4 less than Winston, but 1,550 yards with 13 touchdowns and only 5 interceptions. So it looks like Jameis is more an interception thrower, while Fitzpatrick is more of a touchdown thrower. I think this week it should be a shootout in Carolina. So I think Ryan Fitzpatrick is a great add should you be hurting at quarterback, or if you are in indeed 2 quarterback leagues. We're going to move on to our running backs. My number 1 running back add for Week 9 is Peyton Barber from Tampa Bay, who's owned in 40% of Yahoo leagues. While I don't think this is a token for much home run success, I think that Peyton Barber is a solid pickup this week. He had his second solid game of the season in Week 8, although he wasn't 100%. But regardless, he had 19 carries for 85 yards and a touchdown. Ronald Jones looks to be out for an extended time with that hamstring injury, so I do think Peyton Barber warrants a pickup. I'm somebody who's not high on him myself. I think he's very inconsistent, although he showed well last year at the end. I think that maybe if there's somebody who's in a bind at running back, you pick him up and maybe try to trade him and see what you can get, maybe in a package deal. My number 2 add for Week 9 is Ito Smith from Atlanta, who was owned in 50% of leagues, but now after the bye, he dropped down to 37%, so a 13% drop in ownage. I think that his role is unchanged. However, he's still getting many red zone touches, in fact, more than some big-name players like Ezekiel Elliott. He's only on the field for 29.5% of the snaps compared to Coleman's 37.5%, but I think there is still room to grow for him, and I think he has a chance to show well. This week, I would consider him a decent flex. I think, like I said, he has room to grow. So Ito Smith, don't hesitate to add him. My number 3 add is on bye this week from Philadelphia, and that's Josh Adams at running back. He's only owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. He was in the Heisman talks at Notre Dame, and I do think this is a highly touted rookie. However, we're not going to be able to see him this week. We're not going to be able to use him, but do scoop him anyway because he has a team-high 9 rushes for 61 yards in Week 8, and he looked pretty strong in the backfield. Looked like to possibly own it. Maybe it's his for the future. And I do think that he has been capitalizing on his opportunities recently. I think he could secure that backfield Week 10. My number 4 running back for the week. Usually I started by saying only owned in, but I'm going to start this one by saying already owned in 52% of Yahoo leagues, and that's Derrick Henry from Tennessee. And usually I don't talk about guys who are owned in more than 50% of Yahoo leagues, but he is somebody who might have been dropped. He could be a nice add for you if you need running back depth. He still has a team-high 12 red zone carries, which is it's pretty solid if you're looking for touchdowns. And I don't think that he's a money-in-the-bank pick, but I think that he might turn up down the stretch. We've understood him as a highly touted prospect now for some time out of Alabama. I do think there are worse ads this week at running back, so don't hesitate to add Derrick Henry if you're hurting at running back. My number 5 ad this week, probably someone who you're not going to be starting from the New York Jets, owned in 6% of Yahoo leagues, and that's Elijah McGuire. He started practicing with the team last week. He has 3 weeks to be activated, so it looks like an encouraging sign that he's getting back on the field. Don't forget Bilal Powell, who went on IR last week. He had 40% of snaps. He's leaving on the table for another running back. We've seen Trenton Cannon last 2 weeks kind of come up in that backfield, but I think Elijah McGuire has the better skill set. He's very fast. He has good athleticism, good hands. So I think he must supplant Trenton Cannon first before we can consider him into a flex or starter category. But I do think that Elijah McGuire has the potential and the means to make a do of that backfield. So keep an eye on him. Number 6 moving forward is Wendell Smallwood, owned in 43% of Yahoo leagues. He's on bye this week, but he last week had 8 rushes for 24 yards, as well as secured 2 of 3 targets for 42 yards and a touchdown on a nice 28-yard touchdown. And he might be available or he might be dropped because he's on bye this week. So he's somebody that I do think it is a solid investment in, because it looks like he has secured a spot with or behind Jamal Adams, who I aforementioned before. So pick up Wendell Smallwood if you're in a bind at running back. Number 7 is Trenton Cannon from the New York Jets. Cannon is only owned in 9% of Yahoo leagues. He only had 6 rushes for 12 yards, but he caught 3 catches for 12 yards in Week 8 versus the stingy Bears. So I didn't expect much out of him in that matchup. Miami's giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to running back this week, and they are going to face Miami in Week 9. So I do think that Trenton Cannon is a good speculative ad. Like I said, he is fighting for snaps going to be soon here with Elijah McGuire. So they're going to be battling, and I don't think that either of them is a great start, but I do think that if you're looking for somebody who's going to get the first crack at touches, perhaps Trenton Cannon might do that. He might run away with a job. So if you're picking up Cannon, that's what you're banking on. But I do think long-term and more logistically speaking, due to their skill sets, I think Elijah McGuire is the backfield to own in New York. Moving on to our wide receivers. Number 1 as of a few hours ago, and that is due to the Demaryius Thomas trade, and that is Courtland Sutton from Denver, owned in 13% of Yahoo leagues. So now he's going to sit number 2 behind the injury-prone Emmanuel Sanders in that offense. He's not had a double-digit fantasy game in 2018, but I'm not worried about that. You're looking at the second half of the season, not the first half. He was seeing already 69% of offensive snaps. Demaryius Thomas was seeing 74%, so ahead of him, and he was gobbling up snaps and targets. So I do think that Courtland Sutton, you could probably expect about a double of what he's had so far, statistically speaking. And I do think that they're going to get the ball moving towards him a little bit more. I would consider him a wide receiver 3 with wide receiver 2 upside, and I would not walk. I would run to the waiver wire to grab Courtland Sutton. Moving on, my number 2 wide receiver ad for Week 9 out of Seattle, only owned in 4% of Yahoo leagues, somebody I talked about in my last 3 podcasts, and that is David Moore, the sophomore receiver. Going into Week 8, he had 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games. Well, he made good in Week 9. Now he's up to 10 catches for 182 yards and 4 touchdowns in his last 3 games. He looks like the number 1 option over Doug Baldwin and Tyler Lockett right now. And while I'm not seeing that that's going to be something that's consistent, he looks like that he's definitely earned himself a substantial role in that offense. It looks like a revitalized Seattle offense, especially throwing the ball. We know they can run the ball, but now Chris Carson looks to have taken over that backfield. We've seen Tyler Lockett been showing up, Doug Baldwin here and there, so adding David Moore to that mix is really healthy for that offense. I think he's a wide receiver 4 with wide receiver 3 upside. He's definitely a safe Week 9 play, I would consider. I think he has good touchdown upside. Russell Wilson's building his chemistry with him, and I do think that David Moore is somebody who maybe if you're luxurious at receiver, you can move right now, somebody you sell high, because I don't see it getting much better than this for David Moore. However, if you need him for bye weeks or something extended past that, I understand, and I would not hesitate to hang on to David Moore either. Moving on to number 3, another receiver who I talked about the last 3 weeks from New Orleans, and that is Traquan Smith, owned in 30% of Yahoo leagues. He had a huge entrance in Week 5. He's kind of dwindled since then. And while he's not looking like the most attractive play for Week 9, he's firmly established himself as a number 2 receiver behind Michael Thomas, that is, and in front of Cameron Meredith. I see success in this guy's future. I think he's a wide receiver 4 right now, with wide receiver 3 and even 2 upside we should treat him as. I think that if Tre'Quan Smith has somehow been dropped in your league or has made it this far not owned, you definitely need to go pick him up if you have a spot, even though it's heavy with bye weeks. I think Tre'Quan Smith could pay dividends down the stretch. He's only getting more snaps per game. Looks like he's gaining Drew Brees' trust, and in that offense, nothing can be taken for granted. So I think Tre'Quan Smith, wonderful add at number 3. Moving on to number 4, from Carolina, still only owned in 17% of Yahoo leagues. Another Moore, DJ Moore. So DJ Moore in Week 8, while Torrey Smith was sidelined, he got 5 of 6 targets for 90 yards. He added 39 rushing yards on 2 rushes. I think even if Torrey Smith returns, or when he does return, which is probably this week or coming up, I think that it's clear that Carolina wants more involvement from Moore. I think they're willing to get him the ball in more than one way, as we could see from the rushing and the passing. I think he's a safe Week 9 flex with room to grow in that offense. I think he has wide receiver 4 status and possibly even wide receiver 3 this season, should he keep improving and getting more consistent in that offense, getting chemistry with Cam Newton, becoming more involved in that offense. And I think that's something he is capable of, and that's a preview of what's maybe to come in Carolina. Moving on, number 5 is Devontae Parker from Miami, still only owned in 14% of Yahoo leagues. He saw a team-high 9 targets in Week 8 with Albert Wilson and Kenny Stills out, and he's had over 125 yards on 6 catches on those 9 targets. I think that Kenny Stills, his return is right around the corner. I think that there's a lot of quarterback frustration. It results with Tannehill not being healthy, Brock Osweiler being ineffective. I think that Devontae Parker as a Week 9 start would be high risk, high reward, but he does have a high ceiling. We've seen, obviously, from Week 8 in his offense what he can do. So I would treat him as a wide receiver 4 with wide receiver 3 or 2 upside when Stills or other receivers are out. Moving on to number 6, from Green Bay, only owned in 7% of Yahoo leagues, and that's Marquez Valdes-Scantling, somebody I've talked about before. Over the last 3 games, he's had 12 catches for 216 yards, as well as 2 touchdowns. His role didn't dwindle in Week 8, even with the return of Cobb and Geronimo Allison, and that was the big question for Marquez Valdes-Scantling, is he going to be consistent? Is he going to have that role still when these other guys come back? And it looked like that he did. He had 5 targets in Week 8, and I think he is somebody that you want to hold if you already have, or if not, you want to go pick up, because he has upside as a wide receiver 4 or 3. I don't think that he's particularly a strong start in Week 9, but I do think he's a great hold. He is ranked as a top grade from Pro Football Focus, and I think that he has great tangibles. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, somebody you want to at least monitor and keep an eye on. Number 7, Tyrell Williams from the Chargers, owned in 34% of Yahoo leagues. Somebody who's a little bit low on my list because he was probably picked up in Week 8 last week. He's somebody I did mention last week, and he also has a tough Week 9 matchup in Seattle. However, over the last 2 games, he's had 7 catches for 236 yards and 3 touchdowns, and that can't be overlooked. I think he's a risky Week 9 play, but if he pays off here, he would look really good for your depth, possibly during the bye weeks or possibly even a trade. So I think that maybe Tyrell Williams is somebody you want to invest lightly in, and maybe it pays off. If it doesn't, go ahead and drop him, because we've seen him kind of as an inconsistent receiver as is. But I think he's worth the gamble here. Number 8, somebody who was number 1 going into the day, going to be on my wide receiver ads. Now back to number 8. That is Kiki Kuti from Houston, and 21% of Yahoo leagues. His hamstring's still hurting. He's not healthy. This Demaryius Thomas trade only further complicates things. It took him, like I said, from number 1 to number 8, so I really do think that puts a large dent in his value. But I still think that maybe it's not someone you want to invest a top waiver claim in, but I think that he's somebody you still might want to pick up a sneaky bet down the stretch. We saw his usage in his debut. He was in the backfield, peppered with targets. And while I do think that Demaryius Thomas, like in Denver, gobbles up catches and gobbles up targets, snaps, I do think that he's going to take that down to Houston, and there's going to be kind of a clouded room for Kiki QT. But if you have the room, I understand that it's heavy buys this week, but if you can keep him or pick him up and maybe see if we can defy the odds, that I think that he has some wide receiver 4 or 3 upside. My next receiver is Kendrick Bourne from San Francisco. He's owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues, even though last week, week 8, he had 10 targets, filling in for Pierre Garçon, so he looked like the main beneficiary there of Garçon's absence. They're on a short week this week as they play Thursday. I think he might fill in for Garçon because it looks like Garçon might not be able to get healthy in time for that game. It looks like he's overtaken Dante Pettis' offensive role at the very least, reducing Pettis back to mainly special teams. I do think that as long as Pierre Garçon sits, or he might even be traded before the Thursday deadline, I think that would make Kendrick Bourne an attractive play in a volume-based setting. So I do think Kendrick Bourne somebody to keep an eye on. My last receiver, number 9, is Deontay Burnett from New York Jets. Someone probably you haven't heard, 0% Yahoo owned. He had last week, week 8, 4 catches on all 4 targets for 61 yards. And something you might not know about him is he went to USC with Sam Darnold. They were teammates in college. And while that's an interesting fact, this could be just blowing smoke. It could be Robbie Anderson returns next week and starts in replace of him, and Burnett is the odd man out. But it looks like that as long as Robbie Anderson is hampering, maybe Quincy Newmont's hurt too, that Deontay Burnett, somebody in deep leagues you might want to keep an eye on, or maybe for the future. And we're going to move on to tight ends now. My number 1 tight end ad this week, even though he's on bye in week 9, so considered a stash, is Jack Doyle from Indianapolis, owned in 26% of Yahoo leagues. He came back from injury last week in week 8, secured 6 targets for 70 yards and a touchdown. He's continuously shown chemistry with Andrew Luck time after time. I think when he comes back in week 10, you can consider him a safe tight end 1 for the time being, as well as Eric Ebron. Number 2 is Jordan Thomas from Houston, owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. In week 8, he secured 4 targets for 29 yards, as well as 2 touchdowns. This week, I think he has a good matchup. He's playing Denver, so I think he is a considered tight end 2. He has tight end 2 back end appeal. I think it's a speculative ad until further notice. I think he has to show a little bit more, maybe this week, next week, in order to consider him as a warrant for fantasy. But Jordan Thomas, if you're really deep in a league and maybe you're off injuries or off buys, I think that's somebody that maybe you can expect a high ceiling but low floor on. Number 3 at tight end is Ed Dickson from Seattle, owned in 2% of Yahoo leagues. He made his debut in the 2018 season this week in week 8. He caught 2 catches for 54 yards and a touchdown. And while it doesn't look like that he's a money-in-the-bank pick by any means, he does have some streamer appeal in week 9. However, keep in mind there are many mouths to feed. Now, we have mentioned David Moore along with Doug Baldwin, Tyler Lockett. They run a lot in Seattle, so don't expect a lot of volume for him, but maybe somebody who can get you a touchdown if you're depending on that. And my number 4 tight end ad, my last tight end, is Chris Herndon from the New York Jets, owned in 6% of Yahoo leagues. Look, I'm not looking for much volume at all here. I'm only looking for a touchdown. He's had 3 of them in his last 3 games, so I wouldn't consider him a strong streamer by any means, but if you are looking for a touchdown, if you're in a standard league and that's a touchdown-heavy thing for a tight end, especially if they're on bye or injured, I do think Chris Herndon is a last-ditch effort there. So if you're really desperate, Chris Herndon might be your guy. That concludes our offensive side of the fantasy talk. We're going to shift over to defensive and IDP talk now. We're going to start with our defensive backs. And my number 1 ad for this week, only owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues from the New York Jets, is Marcus May, who wasn't supposed to play in week 8. He was slated to miss 2 to 3 games with a thumb injury, broke his thumb, but he toughed it out. Little Iron Man he is. Only ended up missing 1 game. He ended with 7 solo tackles in that week 8 effort, and all 4 games he's been active this year, although it hasn't been a healthy year for him. He's had consistency, and he's had double-digit efforts in all 4 of those games. So Marcus May, just about as consistent as it gets at the defensive back position. Number 2 is Eric Reed from Carolina, somebody I've talked about the last 3 weeks, only owned in 2% of Yahoo leagues. He's had 16 tackles and a sack the last 2 weeks, so it looks like as the snaps are rising for him, as he's getting more comfortable in that secondary, he's starting to take control of it. He's a huge playmaker, and I do think that Eric Reed is somebody who has a knack for the ball and somebody you need to pick up if you're hurting at defensive back. Number 3 is actually Eric Reed's brother, Justin Reed from Houston, only owned in 2% of Yahoo leagues as well. And he's had 14 tackles the last 2 games, including an interception last week against Miami. He's another playmaker in the making at safety. He looks like a smash brother to his brother Eric. So pick up the Smash Bros. Do them a favor. If you are starting Eric Reed and Justin Reed at your safety position, that is a strong duo for me. Moving on, defensive back, number 4, DJ Swearinger from Washington. Still only owned in 10% of Yahoo leagues, but he's about as consistent as it gets. He's had 21 tackles and a sack over the last 4 games. As the season progresses, he's almost accrued about 5 tackles per game, which is almost double-digit fantasy points weekly. Week 8, he had 5 tackles, 2 interceptions. He looks like to be a strong playmaker for Washington, and I do expect them to keep staying competitive and keep getting thrown against. So DJ Swearinger, plenty of plays around to go and tackles to go around for him. Number 5 is Tedrick Thompson from Seattle, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. This is the guy who's filling in at safety for Earl Thomas. He first started in Week 5. I took note of it. He had 7 tackles in that game, but he kind of fell in the shades with only 3 tackles in Week 6. But he's back on the map with 6 tackles again in Week 8. And I think Week 9 lays a tough matchup for him versus the Chargers. But I do think they're going to be throwing early and often. I do think he's going to have his opportunities. So Tedrick Thompson, you could do a lot worse at the defensive back position. The next 2 guys I'm going to give you are guys who are not going to play this week because they are on bye. And the first one from Philadelphia is Malcolm Jenkins, who is owned in 7% of Yahoo leagues. Over the last 5 games, he's had 30 tackles, which is an average of 6. Pretty solid, pretty dependable. He's looked like a decent playmaker in that secondary. After he comes back in Week 9, I expect him to get back to his 5-6 tackle ways. I think that he's not somebody who has an extremely high ceiling, but he does have a high floor, which makes him usable in IDP leagues, especially deep leagues. In the final defensive back, I want to talk about somebody who has been injured the last 2 games, but somebody who down the stretch can be a big playmaker for you, and that's Trey Boston from Arizona, only owned in 8% of Yahoo leagues. He's on bye this week. He didn't play the last 2 due to injury. But over the first 6 games, he's had 40 tackles and 3 picks. I do think that speaks volumes of what the kind of player he's developed into. So I think Trey Boston, if you have depth at your defense, if you want to go ahead and add him for Week 10 when he comes back, hopefully healthy, that's a strong stash. Moving on to our last segment of the evening, and that is linebackers. And my first linebacker, my number 1 overall defensive ad this week, is going to be Deion Jones from Atlanta, and he's not even going to play in Week 9. He's only owned in 11% of Yahoo leagues, but it looks like he's going to sit the final game out of his long absence from injury. And I do fully expect him to return to his form, which is we could consider elite LB1 status, as soon as he puts the pads on and gets back there, whenever that may be, hopefully Week 10. I do think this is your last chance to get him as a stash. Probably this week he will be picked up in your IDP leagues if you do have a savvy owner out there who recognizes the looming of what's coming, and that's Deion Jones' return. He is an animal, a beast. He is somebody that is racking up tackles, forcing fumbles left and right since he's been on the scene. So I do think Deion Jones is worth your waiver this week. Go ahead and scoop him. My number 2 linebacker for Week 9 is Raekwon McMillan, somebody I talked about last week from Miami, still only in 1% of Yahoo leagues. Over the last 4 games, he's had 28 tackles, so an average of 7, healthy there. It looks consistent in the middle of Miami's defense, and most importantly, he looks healthy, like I said, coming back from that ACL injury. So I do think that Raekwon McMillan continues to produce, he and Kiko Alonso look like a solid tandem in the middle of that defense. So Raekwon McMillan warrants LB2 status, in my opinion. Go ahead and pick him up and consider him a safe start. Number 3 is A.J. Klein from New Orleans, only owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. A.J. Klein over the last 3 weeks has had 20 tackles. On the season, he's had 48, so this is looking like a good season for him. He is, of course, a tackle machine over his career in Carolina, so I do think that he looks healthy, and it's a great matchup for him versus the Rams. Of course, we know Todd Gurley's going to get his fair share of carries, so A.J. Klein, expect him to rack up the tackles. I think he's a consistent maybe 10 to 15, so maybe 5 to 8 tackles this week for him. At number 4, Shaq Thompson from Carolina, owned in 3% of Yahoo leagues. Over the last 3 games, he's had 26 tackles. I'm a little bit skeptical here. He is known to be a pass rusher, and he is skilled at that, so that might not be his bread and butter as an inside tackler. However, a career-high 13 tackles in Week 8. I don't think that he's somebody that's a money-in-the-bank pick for 15 to 18 points, maybe 8 to 9 tackles a week. I don't think that's the norm for him. However, over the last 3 games, that 26 tackles, that can't be overlooked. So he's a good pickup, I think, for this week. See how it goes. Maybe somebody who falters off, but if he keeps up this pace that he's on, it will set career highs for him, and he's scary good right now. So Shaq Thompson, somebody that you don't want to run away from, somebody you want to go and get. Number 5, Mark Barron, owned in 26% of Yahoo leagues. He's finally looked healthy. He's showed up in his first game back, but since then he's kind of fallen off the tackles. He looked healthy in Week 8, providing 6 tackles. He can be a beast when healthy. We've seen him. He's another playmaker in that defense in the middle of the field. He can play a little bit in the secondary too. We've seen him at defensive back in his career. So very fast, very versatile. He's a high ceiling, high floor kind of guy when he's healthy. So Mark Barron, I think, is a good pickup. Coming in at number 6, Sean Lee from Dallas, owned in 13% of Yahoo leagues. He looked healthy before the bye, registering 6 tackles. I do think that Leighton Vander Esch is a problem for him. I do think that in the fantasy community, they are both risky ads due to the rotational existence that happens to be there in that position for them. I do think one of them is going to prevail. Sean Lee's probably going to get the first crack to get snaps, but I think he's a safe ad. Leighton Vander Esch is a good stash still because Sean Lee, we know, has a problem with those hamstring injuries. So if Lee were to go down, Leighton Vander Esch is somebody who would be thrust upon that LB2 status. So I do think if you're looking for maybe a handful of tackles, 5-6 tackles, Sean Lee might be your man to go to. There's, of course, time after time we've seen the consistency of him registering tackles, and although he's been hurt, I do think that Sean Lee, when active, does present good opportunity for tackles. So moving on, number 7 is Markel Lee from Oakland, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. He's only had 2 solid weeks, and that was Week 4. He had 10 tackles. I talked about him in my Week 5 podcast. But since then, he's faltered. He's fallen off completely. But Week 8, he's registered 11 tackles in this past week. While he's remained very inconsistent, I do think he's their best inside linebacker. Derek Johnson has not been playing there. They released him since. So I do think that they are all in on Markel Lee. But as much as he has a high ceiling, I do think he has a very low floor, currently at least. So keep an eye on Markel Lee. Put him on your watch list. If he shows some kind of consistency, he's somebody that can maybe make 8 to 10 tackles if given the right snaps and given the right matchup. So I do think that this week, though, he does have a nice matchup Thursday versus San Francisco. They tend to run it a good bit and keep things short. So if you're desperate, I do think that Markel Lee might be somebody you're looking at. Like I said, very inconsistent. He showed well last week. Hopefully that's a trend of things to come. But unless you're very, very, very hurting at linebacker, you're probably looking elsewhere or waiting it out and adding Markel Lee to your watch list. And 2 other linebackers, number 8 and 9, guys that probably I wouldn't warrant to start this week unless you're very desperate. However, guys that you definitely want to keep on your watch list because these guys have track records of being substantial tackle machines. Number 8 coming in is Dorian O'Daniel from Kansas City, 0% owned in Yahoo leagues. He took over at linebacker 2 weeks ago when Terrence Smith tore his ACL. In his 2 starts, he's had 8 tackles. So I do think there is room to grow for him before he warrants startability. But I do think I do notice his snap count rising. He's a very talented rookie, highly touted out of Clemson. So in Week 9, he has a tasty matchup with Cleveland. Let's see how he does before we deploy him into our lineups. But let's keep Dorian O'Daniel on the watch list, as well as number 9, somebody I talked about before, and that is Josey Jewell from Denver. He's owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. He showed up big time with 8 tackles in Week 3, and I talked about him in my Week 4 podcast. Recommended to pick him up because I really liked his potential. He was a ball hawk out of Iowa. He's a playmaking, tackling machine, great in pass coverage, great raids in the preseason as far as Pro Football Focus goes. However, he's kind of fallen off since then. Brandon Marshall has kind of been splitting time with him, and we've seen the Broncos try to get the best out of Brandon Marshall, but it hasn't been there. He's been hurting. We've heard rumors of Brandon Marshall might not even make it on the team much longer. He's being offered out in trade. So Josey Jewell, somebody who last week they gave him a vote of confidence, started him. He had 5 tackles in Week 8, so I do think there is room to grow for him before we warrant him fantasy startable. But I think we keep an eye on him. Like I said, great reads from Pro Football Focus, great coverage linebacker, great in college at Iowa. Josey Jewell, somebody you want to keep an eye on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening in tonight on Johnny Freak in Fantasy. Just made a Twitter for all your questions, all your tweets you need. If you want to hit me up with a question, sit starts, trades, I'll send out weekly and daily text messages involving players to pick up, notes to keep tabs on. So really good advice. If you want to go follow my Twitter, it's JohnnyFreakInF1. So that is, once again, JohnnyFreakInF1. So I want to thank you for your follows in advance. Thank you for viewing, listening. Thanks for your subscriptions, everything you do, fans. Fantasy Nation, I thank you. I hope you have a good night. Good luck in Week 9. We'll see you next week on Johnny Freak in Fantasy.